tēnā koutou katoa. My name's David Johnston, the Deputy Director of QuakeCoRE and the host for this morning's seminar. So it is with pleasure that I'll introduce Nick Horspool, who will be giving this seminar on a matter of life and death, enhancing our understanding of life safety in earthquake risk. So Nick has recently completed his PhD in civil engineering at Auckland University, and I think this talk is largely around his work in his doctorate as well as other work that he's doing. So without further ado, I'll get Nick to maybe give some more context about himself as well as presentation. Thank you.
Kia ora, David. Kia ora koutou, ko Nick Horspool tōku ingoa. So I'm Nick Horspool. I'm a senior scientist at GNS Science, which is a Crown Research Institute based in Wellington. I'm going to be talking today about some of the work, as David alluded to, that I've just recently completed through my PhD at the University of Auckland. I'd just like to thank QuakeCoRE and the University of Auckland and GNS Science for their support throughout my PhD, as well as acknowledging Ken David, Michael Ardag, Joe Dealey, Shannon Ebeling, and Lauren Vanel, who some collaborations will be discussed in this presentation. So life safety risk is one of the fundamental aspects that we consider when we're trying to reduce the risk of earthquakes and the effects on communities. And we've had recent events where we've had numbers of deaths and injuries from earthquakes, and these really stick with communities. And in Christchurch, this has been recognised through the symbolic white chair sculpture shown in the photo here, where each chair represents one person who was killed in the Christchurch earthquake. So when we talk about life safety risk, we talk about injuries and deaths, also referred to collectively as casualties. They can be caused from a number of different mechanisms within earthquakes. So we have scenes where we've seen in Japan where tsunamis have occurred from earthquakes, and they have quite a high life safety risk and kill a lot of people. People can also be injured and killed through post-earthquake fires, such as that experienced in the Napier earthquake in the 1930s or the Kobe earthquake in Japan. We can have building collapse due to fault rupture that can cause fatalities as well. Other secondary perils such as landslides have the ability to kill people, and Chris Massey would give me a hard time if I didn't point out that actually landslides have killed more people than shaking in earthquakes in New Zealand over the last 150 years. And of course, the shaking can cause injuries and deaths as well. And that's what we most often think about when we think about life safety risk in earthquakes. So for this talk, I'm really not going to be focusing on those secondary perils. I'm going to be focusing on the life safety risk from earthquake shaking in earthquakes. So over the past decade, from 2010 to 2020, there's been approximately 300,000 people killed across the globe from earthquakes. Well over 1 million have been injured as documented injuries, so there's probably an order of magnitude more that have been unreported. Over the same period in New Zealand, we've had a particularly damaging sequence of earthquakes that have killed 189 people and have injured over 16,000. So not only do they cause the human impact of those direct injuries and deaths, but injuries and deaths also disrupt communities through impact on families. If loved ones die or are injured, they can affect businesses with loss of staff, people not being able to work. They can overwhelm healthcare systems. So when we have these mass casualty events, it displaces routine healthcare services. And that can lead to poor health outcomes at a wider community level. And then, of course, we have the rehabilitation costs of injuries and deaths as well. Now, reducing the impacts and minimising injuries and deaths in New Zealand and globally is at the forefront of our earthquake risk mitigation measures. So we have a number of strategies, policies and regulations that aim to reduce life safety risk. So at the sort of highest level, we have the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which aims to reduce earthquake mortality between the period of 2015 to 2030 compared to the previous decade. So that's a global strategy that New Zealand has adopted through the National Disaster Resilience Strategy. So we have measures that we actually report on to the UN on how we're achieving those outcomes in terms of reducing injuries and deaths from earthquakes. We also have regulations and legislation through the building code, where we actually design our buildings to try to minimize life safety risk to a level that's acceptable. So we can never remove it, but we essentially try to reduce it to a level that's tolerable. Now, we do this through a number of mitigation measures. So we have education campaigns that encourage and educate people how to fasten furniture and reduce the chances of objects hitting people in earthquakes. We have education on protective actions such as drop, cover, hold. We have technological solutions such as earthquake early warning systems, not yet available in New Zealand. And then we have obviously engineering solutions such as how we design our buildings to minimize the chance of life safety risk. Now, one of the challenges in New Zealand is that prior to 2010, we had nearly 70, 80 years of very few earthquakes that killed or injured people. So following the Napier earthquake in the 1930s, that stimulated introducing building codes and how we design buildings in New Zealand to reduce the impacts of earthquakes. But really only the Edgecombe earthquake was one that generated fatalities in New Zealand up to 2010. Now, from the Darfield earthquake in 2010, we've had some more earthquakes that have actually caused injuries and deaths. But prior to that, we really didn't know if all of our earthquake mitigation measures were achieving the outcomes because they hadn't really been tested in real life. We had an idea that we were working towards the right direction, but we couldn't really evaluate that using empirical data. So from that Darfield event, there's actually been 8 events that have caused injuries or fatalities in New Zealand. So that includes 4 earthquakes in Christchurch, the Darfield, the February 2011, as well as the June and December 2011 earthquakes as well. Following that, we had the 2013 Cook Strait earthquakes that occurred a month apart that caused some injuries in Wellington and the upper South Island. And then we had the 2014 Eketahuna earthquake, which also caused some injuries. And so really life safety risk in terms of how it occurs over time is really a function of earthquakes and their strength as well as their exposure to population centres. So prior to 2010, we'd had a few large earthquakes, but they hadn't really occurred around those population centres. Over the last 10 years, we've had those, and that's generated more injuries and deaths. Now, in New Zealand, we're in quite a unique position where we have the Accident Compensation Corporation, which is our publicly funded accident insurance scheme, which tries to reduce the liability of people for accidents in New Zealand. But what it means is that anyone who is injured or killed in a natural hazard, they're eligible for ACC treatment as well. Now, this is great because it means that there's no barriers to healthcare for people who are injured in natural hazards, but it also creates an opportunity because information on how people were injured and where and what their injury types were are collected by ACC. And so this allows us to use this information to research how people are injured, where they're injured, what their injuries are. And this is often used, this database, for other areas such as vehicle accidents, fire, household fires, and other hazards. It hasn't been used prior to the Canterbury earthquakes for any research on earthquakes. Now, from those 8 earthquakes that I discussed earlier, there's been around 16,000 injuries and that have been reported and 189 deaths. So the ACC data has some very high level information on where people were and what happened. If you've ever hurt yourself skiing or fallen off your bike, you'll know that the information is often a free field response. So when you describe what happened, you could say fell off bike, or you could say I was riding down a hill and fell off my bike after I hit a rock. So some of the information is useful for data analysis, but it doesn't really give us high level insights. Recognizing this, a group called RISE, which stands for the Group Researching Health Impacts of Seismic Events, which was driven out of the University of Otago and involved David Johnson from Mass University, set up a survey that was sent out to people who were injured in those 8 earthquakes to collect more information on the cause and context of those earthquakes injuries. There was quite a high response rate of about 13%, and this provides a much richer data set to be able to analyze how people were injured and killed in earthquakes. So using these 2 data sets, so the broad ACC data set and this post-event survey, we've undertaken a series of research projects to understand some of the investigation of life safety risk in earthquakes. So our key research questions are: what are the cause and context of injury and death in earthquakes? What are the key risk factors? And also then, how are our life safety risk mitigation measures achieving the desired outcome? So this is really using the 2 research questions above to understand if we're working in the right direction to minimize our life safety risk that our policies and strategies are aiming to achieve. Now, in the past, research on earthquake casualties has usually been focused on a single discipline. So it's either come from the engineering side, from the medical research field. But what we've tried to do in this project is really take an epidemiological approach. So we're trying to combine different disciplines together to understand the factors that are contributing to earthquake casualties and how they interact. So this can be described as looking at the social factors, such as demographics of people, how people behave, the seismological aspects, so the shaking intensity, duration, where it occurs, and then elements of the built environment. So this is around building types and damage levels. So we're trying to combine these and look at them from a multidisciplinary point of view. And we've done this by creating what we call an integrated data set for casualty research. So for the Christchurch earthquake, that's probably the most rich data set available for earthquakes in New Zealand and somewhat globally. And what we've done is created a geospatial data set where we've combined geolocated information on injuries and deaths. We've included social science surveys on behaviour, and then a number of building damage data sets, such as the URM damage data set, developed by Jason Ingham and colleagues, the SEBA damage data set, combining that with building footprints to come up with building level damage and locating people in individual buildings that were injured and killed, and combining that with seismological information. Now, this allows us then to look at the factors and what's causing injuries and deaths from this multidisciplinary point of view. So I'm going to give a quick high-level summary of some of the key takeaways from those 8 events, and then I'm going to dive a bit deeper into the Christchurch event. So what we have here is a summary of the cause of injuries and deaths from the 8 earthquakes that I described before. We have the injury cause shown as different bars. So the first bar is structural causes. That's where the structure of the building has caused the injury or death. We have non-structural elements and secondary systems. We have contents. We have loss of stability. So that's where the shaking has been strong to either throw people off their feet or cause strain type injuries. We have action-caused injuries where people have actually done something that's caused their injury. And then we have secondary injuries as well. And that's where it occurs after the shaking. So typically in cleanup or evacuating buildings and so forth. And then we have an uncategorized cause. Now, what we can see is we have the Christchurch earthquakes up the top, Cook Strait, Lake Grasmere, Eketahuna, and Kaikoura. What we can see is that for the 3 most severe earthquakes, the Darfield, Christchurch, and Kaikoura, we see that the predominant number of injuries are from loss of stability, so falls and strains. We also have a large number of injuries from actions. And then for quite damaging earthquakes, such as Christchurch, we have a number of structural, non-structural, and content-related injuries. For those smaller earthquakes with less severe shaking, such as the Cook Strait earthquakes, that's dominated really by contents and not so much structural or non-structural related injuries. We also see that there's a significant number of injuries that occur after the shaking. So a lot of people are getting injured in cleanup or moving through their house after damage has occurred. But I guess what's surprising about this is that falling and straining from loss of stability and action-related injuries are really driving the larger number of injuries. And we'll dive into that a little bit more with the Christchurch event. Now, another question we can answer with this broader ACC data set across events is who's actually getting injured or killed? So what we can do is we can look at gender, so females and males is the main categorization in the ACC data, and we can look at the rate of people normalized against the population exposed for different age bins and genders. And what we have here is those same events, and now we have a green line showing the rate of females that are injured and red the rate of males. And what we can see are two significant trends. The first one that jumps out is that females are getting injured at a higher rate than males. And this is universal across those 8 events that we've observed in New Zealand. The rate is sometimes double that. And the other trend that we see is that generally the rate increases as people get older. So for our younger age groups from 0 to 9, 10 to 19, and 20 to 29, they're actually underrepresented in the injury statistics. And adults and elderly are overrepresented. And we can see that gender divide only really occurs in adults, as the rate in children between genders is roughly the same. Some of these events, such as Cook Strait and Lake Grasmere and Eketahuna, have small numbers, less than 100, so we get a bit of volatility in some of the trends. But if we look at the larger events with more injuries, such as Darfield, Christchurch, and QuakeCoRE, we see a stable trend that's reflective across all of these events. Now, there may be a reason for this. So the reason for females versus males could be due to a number of factors. It could be due to exposure. So are females exposed to higher risk situations? Or it could be due to treatment seeking behaviour. So potentially females seek treatment more than males, potentially if the injuries are smaller. When we see lower numbers of children, that potentially means that children are often either in bed or in schools, which are actually quite low risk environments. So potentially it's their exposure to lower risk settings means that we're seeing a lower injury rate for children. Now, if we dive into the Christchurch earthquake, what we have here is a map on the left showing the distribution of injuries across Christchurch with different shaking intensity bands, shown here as MMI or intensity. And they're color-coded by different injury severity. So green is moderate injuries, yellow is serious, which requires hospital treatment. Critical is more around, say, sort of a more severe hospital treatment in ICU, and then red is fatalities. And we have that zoomed in on the CBD on the right, shown also with building damage state. So the darker the blue, the more severely damaged those buildings. So what we see is that we have a large distribution of injuries that are spread right across Christchurch, even in quite low shaking intensities, but these are really concentrated in the CBD, and particularly fatalities nearly all occur within the CBD. So if we start looking at some of those trends that we saw in the 8 event data and drill that down into Christchurch, we can see that similar trend where women are overrepresented in injury statistics. So the grey bars show the distribution of people in the general population in Christchurch, and the yellow and orange and red bars show the numbers of casualties, or the rate of casualties. So if the casualty bar is longer, that means they're overrepresented from the general population. And if it's smaller, it means they're underrepresented. So we can see that adult and elderly females are much more overrepresented in the injury statistics compared to males, and also compared to children. Now, what we see is that the rates of the more severe injuries are actually pretty similar between genders. But the rate of moderate injuries, which are treated usually at community clinics such as GPs or physiotherapists and so forth, A&E clinics, is much higher in females. So that potentially suggests that it may be injury treatment-seeking behaviour that's reflecting those differences. So females are seeking treatment more than males. Another question we can delve a little bit deeper into is how were people injured or killed in the Christchurch earthquake? So we had a few more different classes in the larger data set, but we can actually break this down now into injury mechanisms, such as falling, being hit, straining, which is another one from strong motions, or other. And we can see that in the Christchurch earthquake, across all of the data set, most people, over nearly 45%, were injured from falling down, then being hit, and then strains. Now, if we look at the fatalities, this is nearly exclusively, apart from one or so, all from being hit. So we can see that injuries are generated by falls, strains, and hits, but fatalities are really from being hit by items. Now, if we break that down into what is actually causing those hit-related injuries, we can look at this, break it down into contents, structural items, or non-structural secondary items. So when I talk about contents, I'm talking about things that are usually decided by the building occupier. So it might be furniture and electronics. And we can see that at home, it's mostly contents, whereas in work or public buildings, it's contents, but also structural and secondary structural and non-structural items. If people are injured outside, it's mostly from structural elements falling off buildings. And if we look at what are those items, furniture is the most common, then shelved items, masonry elements such as walls and chimneys, doors, electronics, and ceiling and glass. Because falls and strains are such a dominant injury cause that is a bit unexpected, we can actually start to look at what is the rate of injuries with different shaking intensity. So people are generally sensitive to acceleration. So peak ground acceleration is a good measure to look at. And we can actually fit the distribution of the rate of falls and strains to a cumulative log normal model. And what this means is we can actually use this model for forecasting a given shaking acceleration and the rate that we may expect people to fall over. So this could be used for things like looking at building floor accelerations and at what level we might expect people to fall over and potentially be injured from accelerations. It's important to note that this, while it dominates the injury numbers, there were no deaths from falls or strains. Now, if we look at shaking intensity, this is now broken up into different MMI bins, from MMI 6, which is where we see the onset of injuries, through to MMI 9 to 10, which is where we saw the extreme values within the CBD. We can see that the rate of injuries and increases significantly with every step in shaking intensity. And we also see an introduction of deaths at around MMI 8 and more so at MMI 9. So at shaking intensities less than MMI 8, we don't really expect to see deaths. If we look at how the causes link with shaking intensity, we can see that the proportion of falls actually decreases as we get more, although the rate obviously increases, and we get more hit-related injuries as the shaking intensities get higher. So we see a similar trend where we're getting more, a higher rate of all the types of injuries, but the proportion changes as we get stronger. So we get more damage from buildings and more people getting hit. If we look at how injury relates to building types and damage level, on the left we have building damage, either minor, moderate, or severe, and then we have the different injury and fatality causes, and then obviously the colours are linked to those casualty states. What we can see is that for minor building and moderate building damage, we see a similar rate in most types of injuries. But once we get to severe building damage state, we see a much higher rate of hit-related injuries and fatalities. And so this suggests to us that falls and strains are independent of building damage state, but hit-related injuries and fatalities are more dependent on the building damage state. We can then look at building construction type and how that relates to the rate of injuries and fatalities as well. So we have the 5 most common building types that were observed in Christchurch. So we have tilt-up slab buildings, timber frame buildings, a small number of steel buildings, reinforced masonry, and reinforced concrete. And we can see that most of the fatalities were coming from URM and reinforced concrete, and we see higher rates in steel, URM, and reinforced concrete at severe damage states. If we look at those hit-related casualties, we can also look at that by building age. So how are our different building codes performing? So on the left, we have the number of buildings that caused a hit-related casualty by building age decade. So everything left of this orange line is pre-code, so before the 1930s. And what we can see is that the number of buildings is much higher for these pre-code. But if we normalize that by the actual percent of casualties, we can see that our some of our older code buildings in the 60s and 80s are actually generating a higher percentage of casualties. So while we get a lot from those pre-code buildings, the contribution to the number of casualties is actually more dominated by these code-related buildings. And if we break that up into the different code periods, we can see that around 45% of hit-related casualties from structural causes were from pre-1935, but around 55% were for buildings that were built with code, either from the 1930s to 80s or 80s to 1990s. There was only one structurally hit-related casualty from modern code building. So that really shows us that our current code, at least in the context of the Christchurch earthquake, is performing quite well. If we look at building occupancy type, so often we want to know whether our residential buildings or non-residential are higher or lower risk. We can break up the injury cause in falls, contents hits, strains, structural hits, non-structural secondary hits, and masonry, and compare that for residential on the left and non-residential on the right. What we can see here is that, firstly, the more severe casualty states are not really occurring in residential buildings. We did have 2 deaths in residential buildings, one from contents, one from some internal masonry, but in terms of the contribution to fatalities is minor overall. But what we can see is that in homes, most people over half of people are injured from falls and then being hit by contents and strains. Our non-residential buildings are our deadliest buildings, so most of the deaths obviously come from either structural or masonry elements in those, but we still see a larger number of injuries from falls, contents, and strains in these buildings. Another element we can look at is how does human behaviour influence injury risk? And so this really can help us understand what people are doing in earthquakes and what the injury risk is linked to different actions. We can also evaluate the efficacy or how effective drop, cover, hold, our recommended action is in preventing injuries. So to do this, what we did is we compared our ACC data with responses from post-event surveys that were conducted by some QuakeCoRE researchers, actually. There was a survey that Julia Becker and David Johnson were involved in, and also Tatiana Goddard from GNS Science. And we use those surveys where people are uninjured as controls, and we use our injury data as people cases. And what we can do is we compare the rates of the different injuries between those 2 groups and actions, and we can come up with a relative risk between different actions. So on the left here is what we call an odds ratio, which can be considered a relative risk. So we compare everything to drop, cover, hold, because that's our recommended action. So if action has a value greater than 1, then it has a higher risk than drop, cover, hold. And if it's a value less than 1, it has a lower risk. On the right, we actually have the percent of actions that people performed in high intensity shaking areas in the Christchurch earthquake. So most people froze, less than 20% performed drop, cover, hold. So what we can see is that protecting property and continuing didn't show us a significant difference statistically compared to drop, cover, hold. But evacuating a building, freezing, protecting people, and moving to doorways had a much higher risk than drop, cover, hold. And in fact, moving to a doorway had about a 4 times increase in injury risk compared to drop, cover, hold. And this was a relatively common action. About 10% of people performed it, and a lot of people still perform it and think this is a protective action. But what this data shows is that it's actually a very risky action because you're moving to the doorway. you're standing within the doorway where you've got a moving door, which is causing a higher injury risk for people who take that action. So to summarize now what this information means in terms of insights for how we can mitigate deaths and injuries in earthquakes. So to minimize deaths, our focus on structural collapse and masonry should remain the priority. The data shows that most of the nearly 99% of deaths were from structural collapse or masonry. So this is through building codes, earthquake-prone building legislation, and potentially targeting other masonry elements such as chimneys. We should also try to minimize, particularly when we're retrofitting buildings and for seismic assessments, is trying to minimize and prevent pancake-style collapse. What we saw in Christchurch was pancake-style collapse can result in fatality rates of around 90%, whereas potentially collapse mechanisms with higher volumes still created within the building could be as low as 10%. So really trying to prevent those types of collapse styles in our design and retrofits. There could be the opportunity to focus more on the risk from heavy contents and non-structural items, which did cause some severe injuries and a few deaths. And we also need to keep in mind the counterfactual. So this is based on what we observed in Christchurch, but we obviously know through the QuakeCoRE earthquake that precast floors have the potential for a high life safety risk. So we shouldn't lose sight of that as well. In terms of injuries, what we've seen from the behavioural information is that drop, cover, hold is statistically the most effective action in reducing injury risk, at least in the Christchurch earthquake. But because a lot of people freeze, potentially even introducing actions around earthquake turtle, so drop in place and cover and hold, may be effective to reduce some of those fall and strain type injuries, and may be a bit easier in terms of people not having to move to seek cover under a desk or a table. I think we should really target some campaigning around not moving to doorways. It's proved to be quite a high risk action, and is still quite common in earthquakes in New Zealand. And because furniture and other heavy elements and contents were the main driver of injuries from hits, and particularly in homes, continuing on and reinforcing that this message is really important, and potentially finding out how we can do this more easily for people, say renters, and fixing these heavy elements to walls in an easy way. I think there's also the opportunity to look at how floor accelerations and multi-story buildings can reduce fall and strain type injuries, and potentially that trade-off with stiff buildings with high accelerations versus ductile buildings with low accelerations could become an element of consideration in design. So where to from here? Well, we've got this really great integrated data set that could be used for a whole lot of other research. So if anyone's interested in getting access to that, please reach out. In the new phase of QuakeCoRE, we're moving from some of this empirical observational research styles to more experimental data and methods. So with Lauren and Lucas, and Max, we've bought Eddie, the earthquake test dummy. He'll probably be at the QuakeCoRE meeting again this year. So we're looking at how we can introduce Eddie into some experimental designs, potentially using force-based risk estimates from items dropping on Eddie. I think there's also the opportunity to understand human stability a bit better. So how people stable or unstable in different ground motions is an area that really hasn't been researched. We've got a new PhD student coming on soon who's going to be looking at some of this data through a more medical lens in terms of the styles and of injuries from different causes. I think there's still an opportunity to investigate more some of those gender differences, as well as why do so few people drop, cover, hold. And I know Lauren Vanel is working on this, but it's an area that's really important for us to reduce those numbers of injuries. And as we understand and can quantify the life safety risk more from some of this data and some of these experimental methods, we can start building in quantitative life safety risk assessment in our decision making, whether that's in seismic assessment of buildings and helping inform decision making based on quantitative life safety risk estimates. So I'll leave it there. I'll just like to put a plug. Remember, drop, cover, hold, and also the next seminar coming up is advertised at the top as well. Kia ora.